If you're not a member of our church, if you don't regularly attend Faith Baptist here in Echo Bay, let me give you some principles for finding a good church. A church that honors God, a church that will build you up, and which you can then invest in by God's grace. And I think there's three key principles that'll help you find a local church that you can invest in and that can invest in you. Number one is geography. It's changed a lot over the years, but as we become more mobile and as the number of churches and church options has increased, geography doesn't play as significant a role as it once did. But I do think it's important that you worship near where you live, because the impact of your church is not just for those who had gathered there on Sunday morning or who belong to the institution, but it should be changing the community around it. It should be having an impact. We should be letting our light shine before people so that they may see our good deeds and glorify our Father who's in heaven. Proclamation, demonstration like we saw last week. So geography, join a local church. Second, do they practice the 4 pillars of Acts 2:42? Those 4 pillars we talked about in a previous series, and you can go back and watch that. We saw that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, the teaching of the word, and not just the presentation of it, not just that it's spoken, but that it's practiced. When I was in college, I remember my Intro to Christian Education course. One of the first definitions we established was, what does teaching mean? Teaching means causing to learn. So you can say stuff over and over and over again. You can say the same information over and over and over again. But if people don't internalize it, if they don't learn it, you haven't taught. And to devote yourself to the Word of God and its teaching, it needs to not only be spoken, but it needs to be lived. So, do they devote themselves to the apostles' teaching? Do they devote themselves to the sacraments or ordinances, the breaking of bread? Do they practice the Lord's table? Do they practice baptism? Those are pillars of the Christian church. Do they devote themselves to teaching, breaking of bread, to the fellowship? Do they actually have a relationship? Is this body functioning? Or is it just a place where we meet on Sunday morning and then we don't talk to each other for another 6 days? Do they have genuine Christian fellowship? And finally, to the prayers, those acts of worship. As we gather together, are we worshiping God in spirit and in truth together? Find a church that practices the 4 pillars. And finally, there's a need for them to be theologically aligned with you as a believer. And again, as the church has grown through the centuries, this has become more of a concern. As geography has become less, as we become more mobile, and we recognize there is dysfunction sometimes that causes people to leave one church and attend one maybe that's a little further away. As the geographic concern sort of drops, this theological concern has risen. So you need to find a church that aligns with you theologically. And I think there are 3 levels of theology. The first is, these are essential. You can't be a Christian if you don't believe in these things. You cannot be a Christian unless you believe that you are a sinner and Jesus Christ is your only hope for salvation. Those are theological concepts which all Christians everywhere must believe. That's theological tier 1. Make sure your church believes those things. If not, it's not really a church. But there's a second tier of theology that some believers do not agree on. One issue would be baptism. We at Faith Baptist Church baptize believers, those who profess faith in Jesus, and we baptize by immersion. We immerse a person's whole body into the water, and they come up out of the water as a symbol, as an outward expression of an inward reality that they are now spiritually dying with Christ and alive in Him. But there are genuine Christian people out there. There are true believers, people who belong to the universal church that don't practice baptism of believers by immersion. I would not attend a church which practiced paedobaptism, that baptized infants, saying, you're now part of our community, and we trust that God will one day save your soul. This baptism isn't salvation, but it's a mark that you are part of this community. And our prayer is that one day you will join us by the grace of God as you give your life to Him. I wouldn't belong to a church family that practice that form of baptism, because even though they believe tier 1, they don't follow with tier 2. Those are the things that I need those things to be in place for me to have fellowship with those people, to worship with them regularly. I can still worship with them at a special service where we're not practicing daily living side by side as a church family. But when it comes to those second-tier issues, make sure that the church believes what you believe about them. There's often more variance on that second tier. Some people think that maybe the origin of the universe is on that second tier, that if you're not a six-day young earth creationist, that you shouldn't really be part of the church family. That's something that has to be there for you to worship here. Other churches are much more open-ended on that. So tier 1, these are the things you have to believe to be a Christian. Tier 2, these are the things that you need to believe to fellowship together as a local church family. And tier 3, these things matter, but they're not significant enough that we would break fellowship over them. I remember when I first came to Faith Baptist Church, there was a precious couple who had served the Lord for years. And they invited us over to the house, and I remember the conversation after dinner. You could tell we were building up to this, but the lady at the church, the lady at the table said, I want to tell you something. I don't believe in the eschatology that many people believe, the way that the world will end, the things that God has taught us about the end times, the last things. I don't believe what a lot of people within our church family believe. And I think the concern was that she and I would have friction over that issue. And for me, that's not an issue we need to break fellowship over. I recognize I don't understand these things perfectly, and I hold some strong perspectives, some strong convictions on those things, but they're not so strong that I would break fellowship over them. There are going to be things that you disagree with your fellow church members, but you can live together and worship together well. Tier 1 has to be in place. Tier 2 needs to be in place. And then have peace among your fellowship over those things which matter, but don't matter so much you need to break fellowship over it. So number 1, find a church geographically close. Number 2, do they practice the 4 pillars? Apostles' teaching, breaking of bread, those sacraments, those ordinances. Do they have genuine fellowship? And do they worship God in spirit? Do they worship God in spirit and in truth? And are those essential Christian doctrines in harmony with what you believe?